We still do 7 NUFC Matters show a week for free. But if you want to help support NUFC Matters, then there are a few ways of doing it. Hit the like button on each live broadcast and video. This helps the channel grow. Hit the subscribe button and select the all notifications bell so you don't miss a single show. If you want to help us financially, then you can join the channel using this button with the membership starting at $1.99 a month. Or you can drop us a donation in the chat using a super sticker. We're also looking for sponsors. If you'd like your brand advertised on the flyers for the show and featured during the ad break, then email John at nufcmatters.com to arrange today.
Attack. It feels like I've been talking to myself again, but it's the only way you're ever gonna learn. You look back and it's all in the past. I'm dwelling on the thoughts I cannot say to you. If I don't say the words, then maybe it's not true.
It feels alright when they come and say to you,
Hi, welcome along to NUFC Matters, and it is the transfer show with Ben Jacobs. And Ben, you are looking very dashing today. What have you done to your hair?
I've got Steve Wraith. That's what. I went to the barber and I said, give me a Steve Wraith. And now we've got an element of spot the difference. The only thing is you look a bit healthier than I do. But it was buzz cut. I've been on my travels to hot places, including Saudi Arabia. And I'm not convinced the hairdresser necessarily knew the difference between 1.5 on the sides versus a 1.5 all over. So it went a little bit of a zzz, and then before I knew it, I've got this look. But give it a week or so and I'll be back to looking vaguely normal.
Good stuff, mate. Anyway, it's clean. It's a good, clean haircut. That's what you've got, mate. That's the way to look at it anyway. It'll grow back, I'm sure, in no time. As always, when it's a pre-recorded show, we ask people to get their questions in. We've siphoned our way through. We've got some really good ones. I'm going to start with Danny's question, which was, Steve, can you ask Ben if there is interest in Federico Chiesa? A rumour to be available for £25 million. Of course, Chiesa was linked with Newcastle at the time that Newcastle bought Tonali last season. So any truth in that Newcastle potentially are looking back at that deal again?
Not that I'm aware of. I think the rumours of Chiesa were overblown at the time as well. So we're in a situation really now where everyone assumes it's reigniting something that never really ignited in the first place. And I don't think that Chiesa ever wanted to leave at the point when he was being linked with Newcastle United. So as things stand, there's a meeting within Juventus, and that is to discuss the future of Chiesa. And his agent, a guy called Fali Ramadani, will be speaking more, I'm told, about a new contract in Turin. But if they don't agree anything, then obviously you get to the point where things start to rumour once more. So there is a chance that this rumour is off the back of the fact that there's a new deal currently being discussed. And were one to be reached, or whilst you're trying to reach one, it obviously helps to have Newcastle United involved. But I'm not aware of any Newcastle approach at this point. The most telling sign as to whether it could become concrete would be if there's no new deal agreed and then he becomes available on the market. But at the moment, I'm not aware of anything concrete. I'm not even aware of any concrete talks or approach or call or anything between Newcastle and Chiesa. And when it was linked previously, I was also not aware of anything and nothing materialized. So I think that's one for now that Newcastle can just put on the back burner, but just keep that half an eye if you want the player on whether or not he agrees a new deal at Juve And if he doesn't, then the door might become open. But I also don't think that Newcastle have got that kind of money for that kind of position at this point in time. So even if they wanted to, they wouldn't be in a financial position to move at this stage. They would have other priority positions, in my opinion, in mind, including, of course, what they're going to do on the goalkeeper front.
Okay, Taylor asks $1 million question, or maybe a $200 million question. He says, how much do you think Newcastle have got to play with this summer?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that the first thing to say is the number they maybe are looking for is in the 30 to 50 million mark for PSR. So that's the bring in number. And they're not necessarily looking at a budget before that, because they want to make sure that they bring in enough to allay any PSR concerns. Now, at the time of recording, there is a vote upcoming, which by the time people are watching this may have already happened, as to whether the financial rules are going to change. But any new changes to PSR will be shadowed or phased in. So therefore, next season, PSR is definitely still in play, and this financial year. So Newcastle are not actually looking at what they can spend. They're looking at what they can bring in, and maybe what they can bring in to spend. So I'm told it's a minimum of 30 million that they're looking for. And then if it's 40, 50, 60, 70 and so on, then they'll have a bit more leeway to move in the market in the summer. And that's why obviously their first priority has been there to go and try and get free transfers. They failed with Tosin, who's now passed to Chelsea Medical. And I know some suggestions were that that was a done deal. I remember on my last appearance getting hammered for going against the grain and saying I didn't think it was closed with Newcastle. And unfortunately, it wasn't. I'm not saying that in any kind of gloaty way. It's a real shame for Newcastle, but they couldn't get that over the line. And Lloyd Kelly is one I think they will be able to complete. It was announced, again, at the time we're recording this, that he's leaving Bournemouth when his contract expires. We knew that already. And Newcastle are front runners. It's not yet signed, but it's getting very close. So I believe that they will get that one complete, even though there was a bit more doubt over the Tosin deal. So it tells you again, they're having to be economical. But we know that they will find a way to bring in some funds. And that may come through one big sale like Bruno Guimaraes, even though it's not what Newcastle fans like to hear. Or it may come through a variety of different sales, including the likes potentially of Callum Wilson, who might find it's the right time to leave Newcastle United. We know that Bayern have had interest in Kieran Trippier. There was a very firm stance against a sale mid-season. Let's see whether that changes. But they've got to find a way of getting to that minimum number of 30 million. And then if they get above it, they're in a position where maybe they can spend 20, 30, 40 million in the market. But I would personally, unless Bruno Guimaraes goes, be staggered if they can spend more than 50 million total this summer because of the financial situation. And I know that sounds very pessimistic, but I think it is the reality. So when people link Newcastle with Michael Elise at 60, 65 million, you have to understand that to get a player like that, someone's going to have to be sacrificed. And there's only really two indisputably big money players in the squad. And by big money, I don't mean any disrespect to the Newcastle United squad. I mean, who's there that you can get the kind of money to buy Elise, buy a goalkeeper, bring in a centre-back? There's only really two players, isn't there? Alexander Isak for 100 million, Bruno Guimaraes for 100 million. There's other players like Tonali that you can put huge value on. There's Joe Linton, who you can say is worth a heck of a lot of money, but these are not players that are up for sale. So when you actually look at assets that are one, sellable, and two, of high enough value to fund your summer window, it may be a case for Newcastle United that they do determine to make one big sale to balance the books and then still to leave themselves with 70, 80 million to spend in the market without any fears. And that's when you start saying maybe a Conor Gallagher, maybe a Michael Elise, maybe a 20, 30, 40 million goalkeeper. But without the sales first, I really don't think they've got a massive amount of budget to work with.
But surely the incoming money from sponsorship, from we have the new deal, of course, with Salah. The Adidas deal probably won't kick in, I would imagine, until the next transfer window. But Salah came in last season. We had obviously a high league placing, 4th place in the Premier League. We had increased commercial revenue, and then on top of that, the outgoings, which are going to happen this summer, players that are going to go out. There will be players who go out. There are players who I would imagine Newcastle could sell. Cameron Mackay asks the question, any on the likes of Wilson? Miggy, you've already mentioned Trippier, and the Bayern link potentially could be resurrected. Who knows? They were keen in January. Fraser to Southampton, not going to get you a lot of money, but these other players as well who've already gone, Richie, Dummett, Carriers, players off the wage bill. So I'm sure all of that will affect Newcastle. So maybe in one respect, you're right saying 50 million at this moment in time. However, would other things not come into the equation and help Newcastle spend more money this summer?
I think because the financial rules work in cycles, the domestic ones anyway at the moment, if Newcastle bring in sponsorship revenue, they'll have a decision to make, which is, do they want to put some of that onto next season and then find, much like this season in January or in a summer, they're restricted again. So when we're talking about PSR and concerns, that's one separate thing. And that's where this get one sale around the 25, 30 million mark, and they'll probably be okay as far as punishments are concerned. But then beyond that, if you strike a sponsorship deal over 5 years and you choose to take some of that money and project it to do a bigger revamp in one window, it's going to come and catch you at another point. Unless, of course, they qualify for Champions League and then more money comes in. If they can ever get themselves in the expanded Club World Cup, that could get you up to 120 million if you go all the way, and a minimum of 40 million. So there's ways around it for sure. But the balance is your football department are basically saying we want, and your financial department are saying let's not overstretch ourselves because we don't want to be in a position where we're reckless. And Villa might find this. Everyone's talking at the moment about Villa and Conor Gallagher. Villa also can't afford Conor Gallagher. If they sell John Duran, maybe they'll offset that and try and buy Conor Gallagher, but their financial situation is dire. And like Newcastle last season, they're heading into a Champions League where they're overstretched and bonuses kick in and wage bills go up, and everyone that joins them this summer will want a higher wage because they're in the Champions League. And what if it was a one-season wonder? Then financially, you have to make sure you've got something to fall back on. So there's never a black and white number, simply because you can take money that you're projecting and spend it for the good of the squad. But somewhere down the line, it's a risk-reward strategy, and your accountants will be saying, don't do it. And your recruitment department will be saying, maybe do it. And your CEO will be saying, I'll decide. Darren Eales will be very important in all of this, especially in the absence of a sporting director. And your manager will be saying, please just get me what I want. And that's just football. Some are thinking about the finances. Some are thinking about the strategy. Some are thinking about the long term. Some are thinking about the now. Some are thinking about the future. And that's just how clubs work. It's not atypical. But I think in Newcastle's case, we know that even in January, they were really trying to get an Alma on sale over the line or something like that to calm themselves financially. And therefore, because they've not, unfortunately, qualified for any European football, and because they only went half a season in Champions League, the repercussions of that financially will be felt, even with new sponsorship. The only caveat is, as people may have seen, and maybe we get into this a little bit later, the Manchester City court case against the Premier League, which was broken by an excellent journalist in Matt Lawton, effectively is saying they're challenging these rules around associated party transactions. And they're saying, why can't a PIF affiliate come into a club like Newcastle and spend what they want and what they perceive to be value? Because maybe the giant number they're putting on the sponsorship for the good of Newcastle United is for brand exposure, is for tourism, is for sports strategy. If we're being more cynical, is for sports washing. Who really cares? If the sponsor believes its value, then who is the Premier League as a non-transparent, non-independent body, the one to stand in the way and lead on regulation? And Manchester City think that's restrictive, and it's essentially a 2/3 majority ganging up on some of the bigger, richer clubs to stop them running away from things. Now, everyone will have a different opinion on that. But if Manchester City prevail in that case, it could benefit Newcastle United, and you might suddenly see a flurry of Saudi-based sponsors coming in, giving them a bit more financial breathing room without the Premier League or other clubs being able to do anything about it.
Well, Alan Miller asks the question, if Man City win their case against the Premier League, does Ben think it'll have a bearing on Newcastle United's transfer front?
Yes and no. First of all, yes, because in the long run, if they win it, absolutely. There's nobody at this point in time. Maybe it'll be different with an independent regulator, but now we've got a general election. That's kind of on the back burner. So if they win it, technically the associated party transaction rules will change, and then there will be an ability for Newcastle to do business with related parties without being under the same fair market valuation scrutiny. And that may allow PIF, for the first real time since taking over Newcastle United, to show their financial flex. And that could benefit Newcastle. So that's the yes part. The no part is just you're going to get repercussions whereby the challenge will be appealed and then fought and then dragged out, and then potentially have both Premier League and combined club opposition. And eventually it will go round in legal circles and bureaucracy before it has any imminent benefit. In the same way that Manchester City's 115 charges case has gone on and on and on and on. And even if we get some clarity, it can still be appealed by either party, depending on what the verdict is. So we're not talking about this being able to benefit Newcastle now, this summer. But in the long term, if Manchester City prevail, maybe in a year's time, maybe in 2 or 3 summers' time, you may be in a situation where the real power of PIF's finances and their wider network starts to become apparent.
Okay, 1862 asked a question. He said, can Ben explain why PIF are allowing its teams in Saudi to help Newcastle's rivals by buying their average players and often above fair market value? Are they incapable of joined up strategic thinking?
I mean, it is technically the same people, because it all comes back to Yasser Al-Rumayyan. It's quite funny, really, within Saudi, because you've got PIF, Yasser Al-Rumayyan, Newcastle chairman, Yasser Al-Rumayyan, Aramco chairman, Yasser Al-Rumayyan. And they're so big that sometimes they're competing against each other. Even if you trace the hierarchy back, it's all the same people. And some would argue it's all Saudi government, although in Newcastle's case, we know the Premier League have said they're satisfied by these legally binding guarantees. So we'll leave that one at that, because we spoke about that for about 18 months. And I think Newcastle fans are sick of hearing that phrase. But anyway, the point is not so much offloading, because I think what people don't get, and in one of my roles, I'm TalkSport Saudi football correspondent, because obviously I lived out in the Middle East. I've been over to Saudi many times now, including in the last 12 months. And people naturally assume that Newcastle is the crown jewel. And of course, because everyone watching this is likely a Newcastle fan. But I can categorically tell you that PIF and the Saudi sports strategy is much, much bigger than Newcastle. And the Saudi Pro League collectively is much, much bigger than Newcastle. And there is a separation in the sense that those working on Newcastle are fully invested in Newcastle, including PIF people. And those working on the Pro League are still PIF people, but they're also ministry people. They're royals. They're Westerners like Michael Emanalo, who runs the central recruitment. And they're thinking about the Saudi Pro League in terms of the World Cup, in terms of the Vision 2030. And I mean no disrespect to Newcastle by that. I'm just pointing out that one is a football club that's fantastic and will hopefully have success in the Premier League. But the Vision 2030 is about sport in Saudi. It's about the Saudi national team. It's about grassroots for men and women. It's about jobs. It's about health. It's about the 2034 World Cup. It might one day be about a women's World Cup. So all of that collectively is more important than one football club. So if you ever get a situation, for example, like was rumoured 6 months or so ago, where Newcastle want Ruben Neves, and of course, PIF can get in a room with PIF and say, here you go, we'll pay Neves' wages, he'll leave Al Hilal, and he'll go and play for Newcastle United on loan. Never going to happen unless the Saudis feel they're done with Neves. Because if they want Neves, they're never going to take Neves away from Saudi to Newcastle, because he's playing for Al Hilal, the biggest club in Asia. He's in the Asian Champions League. He's going to be at the Club World Cup at the end of next summer. You're never going to win if you're Darren Eales, if you're Amanda Staveley, if you're the new sporting director. You're never going to win that conversation within Saudi circles if they want to keep the player. And similarly, if it's the other way around and they don't want the Newcastle player, they're not just going to take the player for the benefit of Newcastle United, because this is about Saudi getting elite players, hungry players, younger players, and that wider collective Pro League mission is much bigger than any one club or player. So if there is a mutually beneficial deal to be had, then absolutely it's going to be a smooth negotiation. And that was the case with Miguel Almiron, where even though the player didn't want to go, PIF people spoke to Al-Shabaab people in Saudi above the heads of the day-to-day Newcastle people. And they said, okay, 30 million euros, that's about right for all parties. It suits Newcastle, it suits Al-Shabaab, it suits the central deal makers. And then, of course, they let Newcastle know and they let Almiron know. And they said, actually, particularly Almiron, he didn't want the deal. And Eddie Howe said, I'm not desperate to force anyone out at this stage. So there is a possibility that one or two of the names that you mentioned could go to Saudi Arabia. There's a natural connection and it could benefit Newcastle. But I don't think financially you're going to see the astronomical kind of fees that people suggest. Because if you look at the one example we've got already, which was Alan St. Maximum going to Al Ahly, everyone said, how dare Newcastle do business with a PIF club? They're going to benefit. But the fee for Alan St. Maximum was way lower than Ruben Neves or Kalidou Koulibaly. So if anything, Newcastle got shortchanged a little bit on that and could have tried to get 10 million euros more. So that's another example maybe of actually, even though the Saudis are rich, they're getting great deals out of Newcastle or fair market deals out of Newcastle, because Newcastle are not big enough compared to all of PIF and all of the ministry to be saying, sorry, it's just not happening unless you give us 70 million euros or something. So I don't think there's any indication that Newcastle have benefited yet from Saudi. It might be easier for other clubs to benefit because they don't have that, at least on paper, conflict of interest. So I'm not discounting business to Saudi. I'm not discounting another approach for a player like Miguel Almiron. I just don't think the money will be as astronomical as people presume. It wasn't for Chelsea either. It won't be for Manchester United and Casemiro if he goes. It's just the reality of the fact that when the project is central and big and so important strategically, these people running it know how to get their business done. And it's not a club negotiating with a club. It's a club negotiating with a ministry, with a state, with a series of individuals ranging from club presidents to sporting directors to royals. And it's very hard to kind of get the better end of the deal in that kind of negotiation, because it's not club to club, it's club to state. And I think this is why, even though a lot gets reported about the Saudis paying insane money, the reality is most of the fees that they've actually paid for the players are lower than have been reported. And I think that Newcastle, if they do business with Saudi, will find that firsthand.
Okay, we are halfway through the show. Let's have a quick ad break and we'll be back after this. A big thanks to all our sponsors: Skips and Bins, telephone 0800 25 45 25 3, email inquiries at skipsandbins.com, website skipsandbins.com, easy contract free and pay-as-you-go waste collection. Thanks to Mr. Vicky's Sauces, handmade in Cumbria. Their website, mrvickies.co.uk, telephone 01768 210 102, or email info@mrvickies.co.uk. Thanks to United Group Travel. There are no strangers on our tours, just friends you haven't met yet. Their website, unitedgrouptravel.com, email beverly.ugtl@gmail.com, telephone 01670 632 460, or mobile 0791 666 4174. Thanks to Media Arts for the technical side of things. And you can also find us as a podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or other podcast providers. You can subscribe to the channel by hitting the subscribe button underneath this video. Hit the all notifications bell so you don't miss a show. Hit the thumb up to like the channel and click share to your social media. If you want to join the channel, then click join for as little as $1.99 a month. If you want to become a member, for a one-off £25 payment, email john@nufcmatters.com or go to membership at the website nufcmatters.com. If you've got a smartphone, hold your camera over the QR code and it'll take you straight there. We also help the food bank on this channel. Go to nufcfansfoodbank.co.uk to the matchday bucket and you can leave a virtual donation today. And don't forget, you can catch all the Euros action at the Gateshead Leisure Centre this June. There are going to be a couple of guest speakers on as well. We will announce them when they are announced, but it's free entry to go and watch all the Euro games, Euro 2024, at the Gateshead Leisure Centre. And our end of season do takes place on the 20th of July. It is in aid of Dementia Matters. We have Super Matt Gibbo and we've got the Long Sands and George live on stage. Tickets from nufcmatters.com and newcastlelegends.com, priced at £10. And John Gibson and Rob Lee will be at the City Hall Friday the 2nd of August. And you can get your tickets from Ticketmaster at ticketmaster.co.uk, priced at £15. Okay, Steve sent us a question on X. He sent us a few, actually. I'll go through them one at a time. He said, who are Newcastle's striker targets this summer, do you think, Ben?
It's going to be interesting on the striker front. They obviously first have to make a decision regarding Callum Wilson, whether he's going to stay or go. I think it is fair to say that Alexander Isak is as good as untouchable. And as a result, they're okay in many ways as far as their strikers are concerned. And as long as they keep Isak and he keeps scoring 20 goals or so, then you would expect them to go for a relatively young option. And if they can't get one over the line, it wouldn't necessarily be a disaster as far as Newcastle are concerned. I think there's been rumours in the past about them entering the race for Sesko, but that's not my understanding. I think Sesko is going to either stay at Leipzig and extend, or potentially, instead of that, end up moving to an Arsenal or some say a Chelsea. But there's a lot of hype about Sesko at the moment. And the reality is nobody's triggered the clause yet. So he hasn't decided upon his future. But it's too big an outlay, in my opinion, as far as Newcastle United are concerned. Sergio Guirassy was always one to watch as well up front for Newcastle, but the feeling is at the moment anyway that Dortmund are the team that are really pushing. And because of that, it's going to be, I think, a little bit problematic for Newcastle to try and hijack that deal. And therefore, they may have to start looking in some other areas. Remember with Newcastle as well, the priorities are kind of split. So it's not only about forward, it's also about centre-back. And we know Lloyd Kelly is close at the time of recording, a wide winger, likely on the right side. And they have to make a big assessment as far as goalkeeper is concerned as well. And they have to do all of that, if possible, within a relatively small budget. And I still think that if Newcastle find this big budget, then it's going to be around that kind of Elise, but it's a huge outlay, or potentially Somerville, half the price maybe of Elise. Some say Jared Bowen. I'd be surprised if they find the finances to get that one over the line. But that's where I think the meaty part of Newcastle's budget, if they find it, will go, which means they're going to have to be more economical with the forward. So Sesko, I think, will move elsewhere. Dominic Calvert-Lewin is on the radar, but again, it's not going to be an easy player for Newcastle to sign with the kind of budget that they're looking for. So that's the kind of overview. It wouldn't surprise me if Newcastle are quite cautious, providing they keep Isak, with the potential outgoing of Callum Wilson, and they sort of leave that to linger a little bit to make sure that if they don't find a young profile of striker that suits them, that they can at least know that Wilson is still at the club. So you leave that deal hanging, knowing that you can spend that money on a new, younger addition. But if you don't get one of your targets over the line, then you say to Callum Wilson, okay, you're staying for this season. So if I was to kind of rank positional wise, even though, as I say, they want all of them, I think we say centre-back, okay, they're working on it already. So the first signing that comes in might be Lloyd Kelly, and then that's tick, centre-back done. Then I think they might pivot to goalkeeper, even with Nick Pope being outstanding. I think that's going to be a really important thing. And they know that some of the goalkeeper targets like Philip Jorgensen and also James Trafford are looked at and wanted by other clubs. So they might have to go a bit earlier on that as well. So then you start to think, okay, it's centre-back first, goalkeeper second. And then I still think if they've got budget, as I say, it will be for that right-sided, wide, creative-minded player. So even though Newcastle fans listening at this may say we're screaming for another young striker, it wouldn't surprise me if of the 4 positions they want to strengthen in, striker actually comes last due to availability of players, feasibility and cost, and because they know that at the moment at Newcastle United Football Club, they've got Alexander Isak and Callum Wilson. And if they start the season with those two and they know that they can play Anthony Gordon through the centre as well, that's enough to at least get you into August and then use the final weeks of the window to bring in a striker, or at least leave yourself that window of opportunity to bring in the requisite funds and to see who's available in the market. Because I don't think they can just go out there and sign Dominic Calvert-Lewin tomorrow, and he's a little bit older. I don't think that Bournemouth will sell Dominic Solanke, and if they do, I don't think Newcastle will be able to afford him. And I think Benjamin Sesko will either stay at Leipzig or go elsewhere. So that doesn't leave many options at the moment, presuming that Dortmund are the front runners for Sergio Guirassy as well. So we're going to have to wait on the striker front a little bit longer, in my opinion, before the picture becomes clearer.
Yeah, like you were saying, it's not really a priority if Wilson doesn't go, and as long as Isak continues to score. Steve's other question, you've touched on it a little bit, but he did say, who are the alternative defensive targets to Tosin? Obviously, with him going to Chelsea at this time of pre-recording. And I'll double it up because you've already mentioned him as well. Is James Trafford a target for Newcastle?
Yeah, I think James Trafford is being looked at by Newcastle and also Chelsea. I think Philip Jorgensen is the other one who's a very highly rated goalkeeper. And hopefully from Newcastle's point of view, Chelsea won't get sucked into a battle because Enzo Maresca quite likes Robert Sanchez, and Jordi Petrovic had a really good season after supplanting Sanchez, I should say, as the number 1. So maybe Chelsea just stick with their goalkeepers and Newcastle have a bit of a clearer path. But I think Trafford is one and Jorgensen is the other. And those are the 2 concrete names. I know Marmashvili, who'd been linked with Spurs in the past, is another name Newcastle appreciate. But of the 3 goalkeepers I mentioned, I think he would have the highest fee. So even though they may like the goalkeeper, they might not like the price. And that's why we might have to put him lower down the list of possibilities due to the fact that Newcastle's business is going to be collective, financially speaking. And they can't just think about a target. And if they want them, they have to think about how they get 4 targets, the goalkeeper, the centre-back, maybe even 2 centre-backs, the wide right winger or forward, and maybe the centre-forward. So if you want all of those players and fans listening have got 4 targets, it probably adds up to 100 million. And this, again, is what I said before. Do you sell Bruno Guimaraes if someone's prepared to pay close to 100 million and say, great, we'll go and get 4 targets for the future of the football club? Or do you keep Bruno Guimaraes, but then not have 100 million and then maybe not get an Elise, not try for a Nico Williams who's got ridiculous wages, not be able to buy a Somerville? I'm not saying it's all doom and gloom and they won't be able to get 1 or 2, but I don't see them getting 3 or 4 or 5. So centre-back wise, I think you're looking at Lloyd Kelly. There's been some late interest from some clubs in Europe like Milan, but I think Newcastle feel in control at the time of recording of the situation there. They'd liked Max Kilman in the past, another talented centre-back, but you would naturally think a different kind of profile if Kelly comes in would be looked at if they were to go for 2 centre-backs. I was kind of told on the grapevine a little bit that they'd made an inquiry around Connor Cody as well, but I doubt Leicester would be willing to let him go. Leicester's financial situation will mean they have to get rid of somebody. So you never know, but I don't think there's too much developing or concrete there. That's just one of the whispers that I've heard in terms of internal discussions of profiles that Newcastle might look at. But I think if they get Kelly, then rather than saying second centre-back, they'll move on to goalkeeper. Then they'll look at if their big budget can be put on a right-sided, creative-minded player, and then they'll see what's left for a striker, depending on outgoings and depending on PSR.
Okay, Steve's last question was, could Yankuba Minteh be Newcastle's right-wing solution? This meaning that thus meaning the budget can be spent elsewhere.
Yeah, a very talented player, and it's a possibility. But what I would say is that they're still waiting to determine who the new sporting director is going to be to input to that kind of conversation. So it's too early to tell. And when you're not in a big model like Chelsea with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different people, when you lose the Dan Ashworth on gardening leave, it takes a big hole out of things, because Newcastle's decision-making is not Yasser Al-Rumayyan and PIF in recruitment. It's also not really Amanda Staveley or the Rubin brothers. It's Darren Eales. It was Dan Ashworth. It's Eddie Howe. It's a few select other people. So whoever comes in as the new sporting director will have to take a quick opinion on that if they can. And that's another consideration financially in all of this, that Newcastle are pushing for a big number for Dan Ashworth, not just to be difficult, but because they can use some of that number or all of that number to pay the number themselves to whoever they want. Because a lot of these names, like Dougie Freeman, who we now know is going to sign a new deal at Palace, Johannes Spors, who's the group director of 777, they're incumbents. So you would naturally presume that they're not available tomorrow, even if the offer is made to them. And therefore, Newcastle are going to enter into their own compensation game once they make a final determination. And they'll want that name to start as soon as possible, ideally tomorrow. Otherwise, they're in a position where they've got a hole in their summer recruitment plans. So that kind of decision on that kind of profile, you have to put on ice a little bit in order to first determine, is there going to be a new strategy? Is there going to be a new wage limit? Is there going to be a new incentive-driven structure for those coming in? So if we get Champions League again, if we then don't get it, the wages go down by 25%. Is there going to be a new strategic priority? And Newcastle's model may naturally change, because eventually, I'm not saying today or tomorrow, but eventually it's going to get to the situation where they become multi-club in some capacity, and then they need a bigger network, and maybe they need to be more youth-driven like Chelsea are. So whoever comes in has got a big task, because they're not just going to be like Dan Ashworth. I think they're going to be a mixture of a Dan Ashworth, a sporting director, and a kind of CEO of football, because as Newcastle's model expands, and I believe it will, whether formally in multi-club or whether just in network and informal relationships, whoever comes in is going to have to think much bigger picture and longer term. And this is why I think we're going to have to wait and see on decisions like that. And I would expect Newcastle to want clarity on their sporting director sooner rather than later, because obviously the window opens in about 10 days' time.
Robert Logan says, why are you obsessed with Bruno leaving Newcastle?
I mean, it's not obsessed with leaving. It's more a case of there's a release clause there, and everyone in the industry knows that Newcastle need to bring in funds. So this isn't an anti-Newcastle agenda. I think in every single reporting that I've done, I've said very clearly that Bruno's happy at Newcastle and has no problem staying and will not force his way out of the club. But there's a release clause there. So if somebody triggers the release clause or comes close to the release clause, then you have to logically say that the decision is out of Newcastle United's hands. And as much as Bruno Guimaraes loves Newcastle and sees his future at Newcastle, it's hard, isn't it, for any of us to turn down a club that, if they can afford 100 million, can probably also afford to double your wage or triple your wage and have you competing in the Champions League and winning trophies in the forthcoming season. So these opportunities are once in a lifetime. And as much as I hope Newcastle get Champions League and become dominant and keep Bruno Guimaraes forever, so it's not an agenda about the club, there's a clause. And why did the player and club agree on the clause when Newcastle don't normally agree to release clauses for anybody? It was obviously because the player wanted that opportunity in case the unthinkable happens, that somebody comes in offering insane money that suits Newcastle, suits their finances, suits their recruitment plan, suits Bruno. And that is a possibility. So is it going to happen? I think it's less likely to happen at the release clause number. But is somebody going to try their luck, knowing Newcastle's financial situation at the 85 million mark? Very possibly. And because Lucas Paqueta's got problems regarding gambling breaches, you may remember Manchester City were on the brink of signing him for somewhere in the region of 80 million. So why wouldn't they come back in with that budget and see how firm Newcastle's not for sale stance is unless you pay the release clause? Liverpool dropped 100 million for Moises Caicedo. They were unsuccessful. They've got a bit of budget. PSG are not in the race for Guimaraes at the moment. They're looking at other options. They've had Bernardo Silva, for example, on their list for quite some time. But Kylian Mbappe's left. They've got a lot of money that they can spend. So it would not be responsible journalism to know about interest and suitors and know there is a clause there and say there's no chance that Bruno will leave, because I'd be lying to you. I'd be misleading you. I can say I'm 99.9% sure, speaking to sources, that no amount of money will result in an Alexander Isak sale. But I cannot report that no amount of money will result in a Bruno Guimaraes sale, because Newcastle need funds. They've got 4 positions to strengthen, and there's a release clause there. So if suitors are seeing that release clause and making inquiries 2 weeks before the window opens, welcome to the transfer world. And if Bruno Guimaraes was an Arsenal player with a 100 million release clause and Newcastle were in a healthy financial situation, having won the league last season and dominating, and everything was rosy, and Ben Jacobs came along and said, Newcastle are interested in Bruno Guimaraes at Arsenal, and he's got a release clause, and they're considering making an offer because they know that they could either trigger the release clause or they could bid a little bit lower, and Arsenal may need to sell. Newcastle fans would not be saying, why are you obsessed? They'd be saying, that's great reporting. Thanks for the update. So it is just the reality of the fact that until that release clause disappears, there's always a possibility that suitors come calling. And the Guimaraes exit is in no way so likely that Newcastle fans should be panicking, but it's not impossible. And if it's not impossible, we've got a duty to report that.
Okay, NUFC Steve 60 asks on X, when are journalists going to investigate the Premier League anti-competitive rules and call them out publicly?
Well, I think the anti-competitive rules that you're talking about are the associated party transaction rules that we discussed earlier. So flashback kind of 20 minutes on the feed to get the context there, because that is what Manchester City are challenging. And from a journalist point of view, I think we can only report. And what we know is that these are rules that the clubs as a majority have voted for. So it's not a case of why we're not questioning the Premier League. The Premier League put forwards a motion and it was passed. So you can make a logical argument that the timing of when the preventative rules on associated party transactions were introduced, it was in the aftermath of the Newcastle United takeover. So logically, that is a reaction to not necessarily attack Newcastle, but to prevent public funds and states and governments. So, of course, logically, it was a catalyst specifically off Newcastle. And we'd be naive to say that it would have happened if the Newcastle United takeover hadn't. But obviously,
because we could say, where were these people when Mike Ashley was paying Newcastle United nothing for Sports Direct sponsorship?
Yeah, exactly. But I think that's what I mean, that yes, it was Newcastle catalyzed, but it's more the fear about states and sovereign wealth funds. And this is why Manchester City are challenging it. And this is why you would imagine PIF would be supporting them. And maybe one or two others that have done deals of this nature, like Chelsea as well. But I do think we have to distinguish between the fear amongst the Premier League and the majority of clubs of the power and the magnitude of a public wealth fund that ultimately Newcastle have and City have, versus just any old third-party transactional deal. Because of Mike Ashley, or look at my club, Leicester, when we were in the Premier League, You got King Power Stadium, you got King Power shirts. The ownership were in with the duty-free dominance they had because of their relationship with the King of Thailand. So when they do a deal, they can call it what they like. But obviously, when a King Power does a deal and they call it what they like, it might be millions and millions and millions. But when PIF do these kind of deals, they could call it billions and billions and billions if the rules are relaxed. So I'm not in any way saying I don't think it was a reaction to the Newcastle United takeover, but I think it was the reaction to a Newcastle United takeover with another sovereign wealth fund. And then the Premier League started saying, and the other clubs started saying, well, wait a minute, Newcastle's a new player. They can break into the big six. You've already got Man City. Is there not a danger if we don't do something about this that every club will end up being owned by a sovereign wealth fund and they'll all just be powering money in? And I suppose the irony of the fear is that paradox of maybe a Leicester complain, maybe a Burnley complain, maybe a Southampton complain, but would they turn down takeover by a massive rich sovereign wealth fund? Maybe some would have moral issues, maybe some would have identity and cultural issues, but if the money's there, it's very difficult not as a fan to get excited about. And then if everyone was owned by sovereign wealth fund, just let them spend what they want, because then at the end of the day, everyone's got all the money in the world. But I think these rules were a reaction to try and give parity, because what we love about the Premier League is the fact that it's so competitive. And what a lot of clubs feel is that they need that strength in numbers. So I'm not even so sure, if I'm honest, that this whole City case and this whole associated party transaction element is that relevant in the context of anti-competition. I think the big bugbear of Newcastle and the big bugbear of Man City and maybe one or two other clubs is more around, why is the vote a 2/3 majority on anything? Why is it not a case of majority? And that way, as more clubs gain power or more clubs want to compete in Europe or globally. But of course, it's a balancing act, isn't it? Because if every single vote had to be majority, one could always be a roadblock. Still, because you would ultimately need 11. And if every single vote was unanimous, then only one club could stand in the way. So where do you kind of draw the line? Is 2/3 fair? Because it kind of stops the big six ganging up and getting 6 towards what might only need to be 11. Whereas 6 towards 2/3, it's a bigger jump. So is that more reflective of the league? And again, if you just allow it to be unanimous, then any one club can just stick their hand up and that stops things passing and you might just get gridlock. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but what I would say is that regarding third-party transactions, I don't personally believe it's for Newcastle or for the other clubs or for the Premier League to be the ones dealing with it. So I'm fully in favour of some kind of rule that makes sure that these deals are within market valuation. But I don't think the Premier League or the other Premier League clubs are the ones to make that determination. Because what business have Leicester City or Manchester United got in Newcastle United's commercial business? And what business of the Premier League got in Newcastle United's commercial business, other than the fact that at the moment they're the league, they're the governor, they're the regulator. But when an independent regulator comes in, why can Newcastle United not just go to an independent body and say, here's our deal, it's at this number for the following factors? And let's say Newcastle United treble their shirt sponsor tomorrow. Is that illegal or is that good business? And is that fair market valuation? And remember, in Saudi Arabia, you can project all kinds of things because they may say we're putting a tourism partner on the front of the shirt and we're paying above the odds because Newcastle are going to be promoting us more and more and more. Maybe they're going to put it on the back of the shirt and the front of the shirt. So it's twice the value. So then when the cameras catch you behind, maybe they're going to go to Saudi Arabia and wear the shirts and sell more of them. Maybe they're putting value on tourism. Maybe they're putting value on World Cup. Maybe they're putting value on non-tangible things like the digital ramifications and the followers that that tourism authority or that airline will make. So model and how you calculate what is fair market valuation to do your deal, it is fundamentally, to begin with, about Newcastle and their sponsor negotiating a deal that both parties think is fair. And then I think they need to take that to someone that isn't the Premier League and has no say or determination from your rivals. And as long as that body is independent, you move forwards. But I don't think it works like this, with clubs voting with a 2/3 majority, where everyone's got their own interest at stake because they're fearful about being supplanted by a new player. And then the Premier League become the determining factor. But the Premier League are the league, and that's where I think the independent football regulator needs to come in. So I'm a firm believer in the rules. I just think the manner in which fair market valuation is policed at the moment doesn't work for the clubs and doesn't really work for the Premier League either.
Ben, finally, before we finish, just want to ask you about this. This was a very funny masterstroke, I guess, by Newcastle. This ongoing dispute that they've had, I guess, with Mike Ashley has been fascinating. And to announce JD as the official sports retail partner, I guess, was just another swipe in this long-running battle between current owner and former owner.
Yeah, I think so. And we know that Mike Ashley wanted to leave with business interests. He wanted to leave with future business. He wanted to leave with promises, supposedly, of expanding into the Saudi market. And it just feels, doesn't it, like Newcastle can't escape Mike Ashley in any way, shape or form. But the reality is that the supplier and the partner doesn't mean a great deal as long as it's of professional enough quality to allow Newcastle United to be wearing the right gear. Then I suppose where the money funnels back and who ultimately sells it has a relevance to the fan base. But I don't think it changes a great deal. It just sort of keeps us talking, doesn't it, about Mike Ashley somehow. And I think Newcastle fans would have been glad to move on entirely and never have to mention his name or his brand or his network again. But I wasn't that surprised to see the partnership. And I think it is just an indication of the fact that sometimes when you leave a football club as an owner, your legacy lives on for a little bit longer. And that's part and parcel of the negotiations and part and parcel of a savvy businessman, ultimately, that Mike Ashley is. He'll always find a way to make a buck if he possibly can.
He is the master of promoting his sports brand globally. So I always doff my hat to him for that anyway. Ben, as always, been fantastic to have you on. Hopefully going to get you on next week. Would like to keep you on through the summer because the transfer window will be opening very, very shortly, and your input is always valued on NUFC matters. But I know you're a busy man. Thanks for your time. Take care, mate. Absolute pleasure. Look forward to it. And by the next show, we'll see how fast my hair's grown. Take care, mate. Bye-bye. All the best. Bye.